There we go. The first philosopher after the pre-Socratics, of course, is a guy named Socrates. I'm going to give you here a list of 4 philosophers. I'd like you to jot them down in your notebook so that you have a record of them. I think this little list will help you as you review during the week and prepare for the exams and so on. The first philosopher after the pre-Socratics is a guy named Socrates. You might have heard of Socrates before. He's kind of a big name in Western philosophy, a big name in Western culture. You might not have heard of Socrates. I'll be talking about him in a few minutes. Socrates had a number of students, but his most famous student is a man named Plato. And you might have heard of Plato before. He's another big name in Western culture and Western philosophy. You might not have heard of Plato before. We'll be talking about him at a later point. Plato had a number of students, but his most famous student was a guy named Aristotle. And you might have heard of Aristotle before. He's another big name, or you might not have. We'll be talking about him at some point as well. And Aristotle had a number of students, but Aristotle's most famous student, a man named Alexander the Great. And you might have heard of Alexander the Great before. You might not have, but he's another big name, and we'll be talking about Alexander the Great at some point as well. Well, it helps if you have this list of 4 philosophers in your notes at some point, and it might as well be here. This list helps you keep them in order, and keeping things in order is kind of important. So it helps you keep things in order, which, like I say, is kind of important. And it also reminds you, of the relationship these 4 men have over 3 generations. There's a teacher-student relationship that links these 4 thinkers. It's almost like an academic family tree. If you start at the bottom with Alexander the Great, Alexander studied with Aristotle, Aristotle studied with Plato, Plato studied with Socrates. You have this kind of intellectual heritage being passed from one teacher to a student, and then that student teaches someone else, and that student teaches someone else, and so on. But we're going to start working our way down through this list, and we'll start off with Socrates. Like I said, kind of a big name in Western culture and a big name in Western philosophy. And the story of Socrates has been a powerful story in Western culture. For a lot of people, Socrates has become a hero, and I think you'll see what's heroic about Socrates' life when we get to that part of the story. Well, Socrates is born in Athens. Wait a second. Let me go back. Socrates is born in Athens. He's an Athenian. As a young man, he's drafted into the Athenian army, as any other able-bodied young man would have been. He serves out his draft term in the army, and then he re-enlists. There's something about the military that attracts him. He's attracted to the military life. There's something about the discipline and the ritual, and he's just attracted to it. And he'll make the military his career. He has a good career as a soldier. In fact, in a world history course just talking about the military history of Athens, Socrates' name would come up a couple of times as the leader of military operations, a significant military figure as well as a philosopher. He has a good career. He's promoted through the ranks. He becomes what you and I would think of as a non-commissioned officer. We'll call him a sergeant in the story. He has a fine military career, but then that aging thing we talked about with Heraclitus catches up to Socrates. And he can no longer do the physical work of being a soldier. And so he retires from the army. He retires, but he doesn't want to stop doing things. But as he enters his retirement, he can't quite figure out what to do for the rest of his life. And as he thinks more and more of what to do, and as day by day goes by and he really doesn't find anything to do, he becomes really depressed. And he gets really down on himself. And he says to himself, my real problem is that I don't know what to do with the rest of my life, and that's because I really don't know very much at all. I'm really pretty ignorant. I'm really pretty stupid. I don't know anything. And he gets really down on himself, becomes really depressed, and starts beating up on himself. He says, I really don't know anything. I'm really ignorant. I never even learned how to read and write, Socrates says. I could have learned. When I was a kid, the city would have paid my teachers. And when I was in the Army, every once in a while somebody would say, "Hey, Sarge, you don't know how to read and write. I can teach you how to read. It's not that hard." And I'd say, "Nah, I don't need that reading stuff." But now, I'm retired. I might want to read a book. And I'm really pretty stupid. I'm really pretty ignorant. I don't know anything. Well, one day a friend of Socrates comes to him and says, "Hey, Socrates, I'm getting ready to take a trip. I'm going to take a trip to Delphi." Delphi or Delphos is just two different ways of getting from the Greek letters to the English letters. Delphi was a place in Greece. It was a beautiful place. It was a nice little kind of vacation getaway kind of place. There's an awful lot of stuff at Delphi to do. You've got a photograph in your textbook of Delphos on page 13 and 15. You have two photographs of Delphi. On the screen you see a photograph that shows the theater at Delphi. I'll say some more about theaters in Greece at a later point. There are temples built to honor different gods. There's a collection of statues out in the planted garden, which was a very famous collection of statues. There are the mountain backdrops and the waterfalls and hiking trails cut through the woods, and there's all kinds of stuff to do. And it was also considered a sacred place. For one thing, it was a very beautiful place, so it had always been considered a sacred place. There are a number of temples built to honor different gods, like I said. And, at least a lot of people who'd been to Delphos claimed that when they'd gotten there, they'd received something. What's called a Delphic oracle. An oracle is when in some kind of weird, spooky, mysterious, eerie, somehow connected to religion kind of way, you get some insight into your problems. Maybe you get a word of advice to listen to, or maybe if you think about that diagram that I gave you of the Logos thing connecting up to the big Logos and to the Theos thing, it's like for a split second that connection is made, and you see where you fit into the whole pattern of the universe. You get some insight into a problem or a word of knowledge or wisdom that guides you forward. Well, at least this oracle thing was claimed to have happened to an awful lot of people. It was a very famous part of going to Delphos was to think about what this Delphic oracle might be. Well, anyways, back to the story. Socrates' friend comes to him and says, "Well, Socrates, I'm going to go to Delphi." And Socrates says, "Well, that's pretty cool. I've been to Delphi plenty of times myself. Well, when you go, will you think about me and my problem? And maybe you'll get some insight into my problem. And my problem is I don't know what to do for the rest of my life. And my bigger problem is I don't know anything at all because I'm really ignorant and stupid and uneducated and I really don't know anything at all." And the friend says, well, you know what the friend says. The friend says, "Of course I'll think about you, Socrates." Well, the friend goes to Delphi. He goes to a temple that's dedicated to the god Apollo. And that temple at Apollo, by the way, is where this oracle was said to have occurred. And so he goes to this religious service, and afterwards he's walking through the planted gardens, just thinking about things. And one of the female priests of the temple comes up to him and says, "You have a friend in Athens named Socrates, don't you?" And the friend says, "Yeah, I do." And the priest says, "Well, you tell Socrates that he is the wisest man in the world." And the friend says, "Whoa," he gets the goosebumps and goes, "Wow, that's pretty weird." And he goes back to Athens and he finds Socrates and he says, "Socrates, it worked. I got a message for you." And Socrates says, "For me?" And the friend says, "Yeah, for you. I'm supposed to tell you that you are the wisest man in the world." Socrates thinks about this oracle for about 5 seconds. Says, "That's about the dumbest oracle anybody ever got. I'm the wisest man in the world. My whole problem is I'm ignorant. My whole problem is I don't know anything. My whole problem is I'm pretty stupid. How can I be the wisest man in the world?" But now Socrates believes this stuff, okay? And if this really happened, and there's no reason to think that his friend would lie to him about it, well, this must be true. And he thinks about this for a couple of days. And every once in a while his mind goes back to it. And he thinks, well, how can I be wise when I don't know anything? And a few days later, thinking about this, he thinks to himself, well, maybe I've been kind of hard on myself. I've been telling myself that I don't know anything. I'm stupid. I'm uneducated. I'm ignorant. I don't know anything. But really, it's not true. It's really not true that I don't know anything. Because I do know one thing. And the one thing that I know is that I don't know anything. The one thing I know for sure is that I'm ignorant. I'm uneducated. I don't know anything. Maybe, Socrates says, maybe that's what makes me wise. My wisdom is that I know I don't know anything. That's my wisdom, that I know I don't know anything. But now if I'm supposed to be the wisest man in the world, that must mean none of us know anything. All of us are ignorant. I'm the only one who realizes I am ignorant. I guess that means everybody else walking around town acting like they know everything, they don't know anything either. None of us know anything. And now Socrates knows what to do for the rest of his life, which is to learn stuff. To go out and examine his life and to see the things he's ignorant about and then to try to learn about things. Very quickly, Socrates begins learning things and then going around very quickly and teaching things by going around and asking people questions. There's a teaching method today that you may run into in your college career called the Socratic method of teaching, in which if you take a course that relies on the Socratic method of teaching, the students show up, the professor shows up, but the professor hardly ever gives students information. Instead, by asking questions and guiding the conversation, the students end up teaching themselves the material. It may be questions over a reading assignment or just questions that don't seem to be coming from anywhere really at first, and then by the end of class, by guiding the conversation, asking the right questions, and setting up dialogue between students and bringing in new perspectives, the students themselves teach themselves the material. You'll probably run across the Socratic method at some point in your college career, especially if you're interested in legal stuff. Maybe you're in the paralegal program here at CF or taking the course in business law that a bunch of you, I guess, are going to be taking at some point. And because that's just become the traditional method of instruction in Western culture of teaching the law. Well, anyway, stories of Socrates going around and asking people questions are recorded by at least two of his students, Xenophon and Plato, the most famous collection of those stories by Socrates' most famous student, a man named Plato, in a collection of books called the Dialogues. Now, each dialogue is called a book, but they're very short books. You could easily read one in an afternoon. They're usually sold in a paperback version like that thin. They're not very long at all. We're not going to go into all the dialogues and the argument that Plato makes in the dialogues. I don't think it would be useful for us or a good stewardship of our time. I don't think it's necessary for this course. But you do have to know how the dialogues work in order to understand Socrates' story. And so I want to just give you a sketch of some of the dialogues so you see how the dialogues work. For example, here's one of the dialogues. It's called the Crito. You don't need to worry about writing it down. Just catch how the dialogue works, all right. One day, Socrates is walking on the sidewalk, and he sees a man walking towards him, a man named Crito. Crito is a judge in Athens. And as Socrates gets closer to Crito, Socrates smiles at Crito and says, Good morning, Judge Crito. Do you have a few minutes to talk to me? And Crito says, Sure, Socrates, I have some time to talk to you. What's on your mind? And Socrates says, Well, first of all, Judge Crito, everybody in Athens says you're the best judge in town. By the way, Socrates always starts off the dialogues this way. You'll see why. Everybody in Athens says you're the best judge in town. And Crito says, Well, Socrates, I don't go around town telling everybody I'm the best judge or anything, but now since you've mentioned it, I probably am. I've been elected judge in Athens for decades now. I've presided over hundreds of cases, maybe thousands of cases, and, I probably am the best judge in Athens. And Socrates says, Oh, good, because, I'm retired now from the army, and, I'm just trying to go around and learn things, and, today I wanted to learn the answer to the question, how do you tell the difference between right and wrong? And I was just thinking to myself, now who could I ask? When I saw you walking down the sidewalk, and I thought, Judge Crito, I'll ask him. Surely he knows how to tell the difference between right and wrong. He's the best judge in Athens. And Crito says, well, Socrates, of course I know how to tell the difference between right and wrong. That's what I do. I'm a judge. I preside over cases. I rule on the admissibility of evidence. I instruct a jury on how to find a verdict. Of course I know how to tell the difference between right and wrong. And Socrates says, oh, good, I knew you would know. So tell me, how do you tell the difference between right and wrong? And Crito says, well, that's, I've never thought about that before. That's a good question. How do you tell the difference between right and wrong? Well, I guess parents teach their children how to tell the difference between right and wrong, and then when the children grow up, they just know. And Socrates says, well, thank you, Judge Crito. I knew you would know if I asked you. But wait a second, that doesn't make an awful lot of sense. What about this? What about that? What about this and that? We're not going into all the argument here, but just the sketch of the dialogues. What about this? And finally, Crito says, yeah, you're right. That doesn't make any sense. Let me think. Here's the way you tell the difference between right and wrong. And he says something else, and Socrates knocks that down. And then Crito says something else, Socrates knocks that down, until Crito finally says, okay, well, I guess I don't know. And Socrates says, well, maybe the starting point for figuring out how to tell the difference between right and wrong is this. And he gives Crito maybe a sentence or two and says, think about that, because maybe that's the way you know how to tell the difference between right and wrong. A few days later, Socrates goes to another man's house, a man named Meno. Meno is a math teacher in town. He'd actually been Socrates' commanding officer in the army. And he goes to Meno's house and he says, Meno, first of all, everybody in Athens says you're the best math teacher in town. And Meno says, well, I don't go around town telling everybody I'm the best math teacher in town, but since you've mentioned it, I probably am. Once I retired from the army myself, I started a little school here, and I teach mathematics, and I've read all the books in the library on mathematics, and I've had scores of students, so yeah, I probably am the best math teacher in Athens. And Socrates says, well, good, because since I've retired, I just want to go around and learn things. And today I wanted to learn the answer to the question, well, how do people learn things? And I figured I'd ask you, Judge Meno, or General Meno, because you're the best math teacher in Athens. Do you know how people learn things? And Meno says, well, of course I know how people learn things. I'm a teacher. And Socrates says, oh, good. Well, tell me, how do people learn things? And Meno says, I've never thought about that before. Well, maybe people learn things this way. Socrates knocks that down. Maybe people learn things this way. Socrates knocks that down. Until finally Meno says, okay, I give up. I don't know. And Socrates says, well, maybe the way to start thinking about how people learn things is like this. And he gives him a sentence or two and says, think about that, because maybe thinking about that is the way that you start thinking about how people learn things. A few days later, Socrates goes to another man's house, a man named Phidias. And you already know the setup. You just don't know what the question's going to be. But Phidias is an artist in town. He makes sculptures. And Socrates goes to Phidias and says, Phidias, everybody in Athens says you're the best artist in town. Phidias says, well, I don't go around saying that, but since you said it, yeah, I probably am. And Socrates says, well, today I want to find out what makes something beautiful. And I figured you would know since you make beautiful sculptures. And Phidias says, of course I know what beauty is. And Socrates says, what is it? And Phidias says, I don't know. I've never thought about it before. As Socrates goes around town, a bunch of stuff starts happening. For one thing, Socrates meets an awful lot of people who have never thought about important parts of their lives. You would think that the best judge in town would have spent some time thinking about how you tell the difference between right and wrong. You would think the best math teacher would have spent some time thinking about how students learn things. But these are people who floated through life. They think they know what they know, and they really don't know anything because they have never thought about important parts of their lives. They just kind of float through life thinking they know everything, and they've never even thought about big parts of their lives. At one point, Socrates tells his students, he says, the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. That's something kind of heavy to throw at you on a Wednesday afternoon. The unexamined life, it's not worth living. Socrates says, if you go through life just assuming you know everything, just kind of floating through life, and you never take a good hard look at your life, then what was the point? It's just not worth living. Well, something else happens. He gathers a group of students around him. For the most part, young men in their late teens and early 20s who've already been through the basic education system in Athens, but they're intellectual types, and they like thinking about things, and they just kind of follow Socrates around, because wherever Socrates goes, there's going to be an interesting conversation and something to think about. Something else starts to happen, and that is that Socrates ticks off an awful lot of big shots in town. Because the best judge in Athens has to stand on the street corner in front of Socrates and Socrates' students and anybody else who's walking by and admit he's never even thought about how you tell the difference between right and wrong. And here he's been taking a salary as a judge for decades and he's never even thought about it. The best math teacher has to admit in front of Socrates and Socrates' students he's never even thought about how students learn things. Never even crossed his mind to think about it. And he's had to admit that he's ignorant. Well, you see what Socrates is doing here. He's pushing these people until they admit that they're ignorant. They admit that they don't know. And then he gives them something to think about. For Socrates, the beginning of wisdom is the admission of ignorance, the admission that you don't know something. Because in that humility and in that modesty, when you say, well, I really don't know anything about this, then you can begin to receive information. But if you hide behind a false wall that you already know all about this stuff, then you never receive any information. It takes some humility and modesty to say, I really don't know much about this, and then you can start to learn things. But Socrates is forcing these people to admit that they're ignorant. And that's embarrassing. You don't like it when people point out that you're ignorant about something. I don't like it when people point out that I'm ignorant about something. That's embarrassing. And one response to embarrassment is to get angry. And Socrates ticks off an awful lot of big shots. He also ticks off a bunch of medium shots because those students go home. And around the dinner table, the conversation is kind of like this. The son in the family, Socrates' student, says, "Hey, Dad, everybody in Athens says you're the best police officer in town." "Well, son, I don't go around saying that, but yeah, probably I'm the best cop in town. Top of the force, that's probably me." "Well then, Dad, you should know how to tell the difference between right and wrong." "Why, son, of course I know how to tell the difference between right and wrong." "Okay, Dad, tell me how do you tell the difference between right and wrong?" And by the end of the conversation, the father says, "Okay, I give up, I don't know. And who's been teaching you to be disrespectful to your father?" "Ah, Dad, you should have seen Socrates use that argument on the judge." "On the judge? Oh, man, should have seen him take apart the math teacher. He had the math teacher crying. The math teacher!" Well, Socrates ticks off an awful lot of people in Athens. So much so that he's charged with crimes. The way that criminal justice worked in Athens was that, except for emergency kind of stuff, but if you wanted to charge someone with crimes, then you waited until the assembly meeting. The assembly meets every 10 days on schedule. At the end of the meeting, the mayor says, "Are there any issues we need to talk about?" Then under Athenian law, all it takes is 2 citizens to stand up and say, "We charge Socrates with crime." Immediately, if Socrates is there, the guy standing around Socrates grab him. If not, then the mayor deputizes people and sends them into town to look for Socrates. The citizens step forward. They announce what the charges are. The mayor calls for the election of a judge. A judge is elected to preside over the case. The judge now moves to chair the meeting. The citizens who are there that day are now suddenly transformed into the jury for the case. The evidence begins to be presented, and things move very quickly. Well, Socrates is charged with 2 crimes because they're Athenian crimes. I have to explain them to you. The first of these crimes is showing disrespect to the gods. Now that might kind of throw you because we haven't even talked about the gods yet, at least not with Socrates. But that's an Athenian way of thinking about what you and I would call disturbing the peace. Part of the job that the gods have is to keep things peaceful in town and keep everybody kind of happy and everything kind of calm and smooth. And when somebody shows up and causes trouble for no good reason, then that's showing disrespect to the gods. It's kind of an Athenian way of thinking about what you and I might think of as disturbing the peace. Just somebody showing up and causing trouble and no good reason. The second crime Socrates is charged with is corrupting young people. In other words, teaching young men to be disrespectful to the elders in town and especially to their fathers. The fathers are really the big players here. Well, Socrates makes a defense of himself. He says, I never taught my students to be disrespectful to anyone. I can't help what they do when they go home. And besides, I wasn't causing trouble for no good reason. I was causing trouble for a good reason. I wanted people to wake up and to examine their lives. I wanted them to think about their lives. Because the unexamined life is not worth living. I wanted them to have lives that were worth living. I wanted to wake them up and get them thinking about parts of their lives they never thought about before. Socrates makes a defense of himself, but the citizens don't buy it. They convict him of these crimes, and then they sentence him to death. And Socrates is led away to a special jail for criminals who receive this special sentence. That evening, Socrates' friends, his students, go to see him. And they say, Socrates, you know how the game is played in Athens. You lived here your whole life. They don't really want to kill you. They just want you to leave town. That's why they've put you in this special jail with no locks on the door and only one jailer who's an old guy who goes to sleep at 8 o'clock every night. You're supposed to leave. So, his friends say, his students say, just play along with the game. When the jailer goes to sleep, play along. Just slip out the front door. We've already got some money together. We've already hired a ship and a ship's captain. He's waiting down at the docks to take you someplace else where you can go bug people in some other town. All you have to do is just slip out tonight. We'll take you, get you on a ship, and you can go someplace else. Well, Socrates says something to his students, which has for a lot of people made Socrates a hero. Socrates says, no, I'm not going. And his friends say, well, now, if you don't go, they will kill you. What they're saying is, you better leave town or else we're going to kill you. And Socrates says, I don't care. I'm not leaving. Well, of course, his friends ask him why. And Socrates says, look, if I left now, I'd be a big hypocrite. I'd be turning my back on what I believe to be true. Socrates says, look, remember, I was a soldier, and I took an oath that I would defend our way of life in Athens. And part of our way of life in Athens is a democracy. And I remember when I was a young man hearing Pericles give his funeral oration, that speech that I summarized and paraphrased for you a few sessions ago. And I heard him say I was better off being a dead Athenian than a live slave. And one reason was that I lived in a place where the citizens have the power, where the people make the decisions. And Socrates says, I made a decision. I promised myself I'm going to live and die in a place where the people make the decisions, where the people have the power. And I still want to live and die in a place where the people make the decisions, even if they make the decision to kill me. That's the kind of city I want to live in, where the people have the power, even if they use that power against me. See, if I left, I'd be a big hypocrite. I'd be saying, no, I don't want to live in a place where the people make the decisions. Well, of course, his friends argue with him. Of course, Socrates doesn't give in. The next morning, the jailer comes into Socrates' cell. He's surprised to find Socrates still there. He says, Socrates, you're supposed to leave. The jailer argues with him. Socrates says, no, I'm not going. About a week goes by, and the jailer comes in and says, Socrates, you haven't left. I'm going to have to kill you. He says, I don't want to. He says, Socrates, just leave. You made your point. Just leave. And Socrates says, if you think I made my point, you didn't get my point. My point is, I'm going to live and die in a city where the people make the decisions. The jailer says, please, Socrates, don't make me do this. I'm going to have to kill you. And Socrates says, look, don't worry about it, my friend. This is a democracy. This is how democracy works. The citizens sentenced me to death. They already had elected you to be a jailer. They elected you to be the executioner. And then they sentenced me to death. It's nothing personal. You're just doing what the majority of the citizens are telling you to do. The jailer sends a message to Socrates' friends. You know what the message is. The message is the sentence is going to have to be carried out. You have one last chance to come talk to Socrates. His friends, his students show up, and Socrates tells them, don't let this stop you. You keep looking for what's true, for what's truly true. Keep examining your lives. Keep asking the hard questions. Don't let what's happening to me stop you. Socrates says, I could have just floated through life like everybody else, but then I wouldn't have had a life that was worth living. The jailer comes in tears and says, Socrates, don't make me do this. He's carrying a cup of poison. That's how the Athenians executed their criminals. And the jailer says, Socrates, don't let me do this. He says that you've come to be my friend. I've enjoyed having you live here in the jail with me. You've got me thinking about my life in ways I've never thought about before. And Socrates says, look, my friend, don't worry about it. It's not personal. It's the way democracy works. He takes a cup of poison from the jailer and he drinks it. And he keeps talking, telling his students, don't let this stop you. You keep examining your lives. You keep asking the big questions. Keep looking for what's truly true, what's really true. This poison that the Athenians used worked by paralyzing the muscles of the body from the extremities inward. And at one point, as Socrates is walking around telling his students to keep looking for what's true, he says that his arms and legs are heavy, and the paralysis is setting into the muscles of the arms and legs. And as his friends take him to his bed, lay him down, very quickly the paralysis moves into the chest cavity. He can no longer breathe, and he suffocates and he dies. Socrates dies when living would be as easy as walking out the door. But if he walked out the door, he'd be walking away from what he believed to be true. He'd be walking away from his values, and that cost was too high for him. And that story of Socrates has had a big impact on a lot of people who've heard the story, read the story, and taken the time to think about it. What do I believe to be true that I'd rather die than walk away from? That's a big question. A big question about one's values and what's important to somebody. What are the principles that I run my life by that are more valuable to me than life itself? It's had a big impact on an awful lot of people. It certainly has a big impact on Socrates' most famous student, and that's a guy named Plato. And we're going to be talking about Plato the next time that we're together.